رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أفضل الخلق أجمعين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. So continuing on from where we had stopped, the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, and we'll start from the beginning, we'll just read from the beginning. He says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد خاتم النبيين وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحابته أجمعين. He goes on to say, قال العبد الفقير إلى مولاه الغني أبو الإخلاص حسن الوفائي الشرنبلالي الحنفي عفى الله عنه. قال العبد الفقير إلى مولاه الغني. The slave who is in need of his independent, his great master, says, okay, قال العبد الفقير إلى مولاه الغني. The slave who is in need, the faqr of this slave is towards his mawla, yani his master, al-ghani, who is independent and who owns everything. Now, mawla is a word in Arabic that can come from many meanings. And the reason for this is that there are many types of wala. There are many types of wala. And wala in the times of Jahiliyyah was a method of creating a form of loyalty and a bond between two individuals. And there were many types of attaining that, of attaining wala. Wala, for example, one form of wala is between the master and the slave. So the master would be known as the mawla, and his slaves would be the abd, the slave. So over here, when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our mawla, when we say Anta mawlana, as mentioned in the Quran, Anta mawlana fansurna ala al-qawm al-kafirin, over there we are saying that Allah is our master, and we are the slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, literally. And yes, slavery existed in the past. However, that slavery, in comparison to the slavery which is the slavery of a slave for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, how we are slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these two forms of slavery are not comparable. We are literally the ownership of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every way. And whereas the slavery that was present in the past was not the case, where the slave would be in the ownership of his master in every way. But we are owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every way. So one form of wala is where you have a master and you have the slave. Now, in the past, the master would at times free a slave, and that freed slave would be known as a mawla as well. And this is known as wala'ul ataqah. So both the one that frees, meaning the mu'tiq, is known as a mawla, and the mu'taq, the slave that was freed, is also known as mawla. They're both called mawla linguistically. There's another form of wala, which is wala'ul Islam. If, for example, someone was to accept Islam at the hands of another individual who was not a non-Muslim, were to accept Islam at the hands of a Muslim, then they would do nisbah, they would attribute that disbeliever who was initially a disbeliever to the Muslim he accepted Islam at the hands of. So would they say, for example, like we have in the name of al-Bukhari, we say he is Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim ibn Mughira ibn Bardizbah al-Ju'fi mawlahum. Al-Mughira, who was the great-grandfather of Al-Imam al-Bukhari, accepted Islam at the hands of Yaman al-Ju'fi. At the hands of Yaman al-Ju'fi. And therefore, Al-Mughira was then known as al-Ju'fi mawlahum, yani, or mawlahu. That the mawla of Al-Mughira is al-Ju'fi. To suggest that, or to show that they had accepted Islam and they entered into Islam at the hands of someone who is al-Ju'fi. So this is also another form of wala. And there are other forms of wala as well that will come later on. Over here, when we say mawla, we're referring to how we are slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, قال العبد الفقير إلى مولاه الغني. The slave, and al-faqir is the sifa, who is in need of, yani his faqr is towards who? He is in need of his master who is independent, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like such. If a person approaches Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with humility, accepting that he is the one in need of the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant him his blessings. But if one approaches Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as independent, and as Fir'aun would say, for example, that he himself is a Lord, he's not in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will treat that individual like that. In reality, everyone is a slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the author, he starts off with this to show that we are always in need of the grace and the mercy and the acceptance and the assistance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he is the one who is absolutely independent. Ya ayyuhan nas antumul fuqara'u ila Allah wallahu huwal ghaniyyul hamid. O people, you are the ones who are in need of Allah. Allah is al-ghani, Allah is al-hamid. And he's absolutely independent. He is not in need of anyone, number one. Number two, he's, along with being independent, he is the most praised. He's always praised. So he says, قال العبد الفقير إلى مولاه الغني أبو الإخلاص حسن الوفائي الشرنبلالي الحنفي. Abu al-Ikhlas, Hassan is the name of the author. Al-Wafa'i is nisba, as we mentioned, to Ahlul Wafa. And Ahlul Wafa, as we mentioned before, is a tariqah from the turuq of the Sufiyya. And this goes back to an individual by the name of Sayyid Muhammad Wafa. Sayyid Muhammad Wafa, who passed away in the year 765. 765 after Hijrah. And he was a great righteous individual who was very close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he had students and he taught them, and they continued on this tariqah. So al-Wafa'i is nisba to that tariqah. To that tariqah from the turuq of the Sufiyya. طيب, then he says al-Wafa'iyu ash-Shurumbulali. And we mentioned before that Shurumbulal is nisba towards the town where he is from in Egypt. Al-Hanafiyu, and the author is a Hanafi jurist, so he made nisba towards his madhab fiqhi. And these nisab, ahbab, these nisab can be towards different things, because the purpose of these nisab, which is basically the attribution, and at the end you add this ya, is known as ya'un nisbah. The purpose of this is ta'rif, so that a person or individuals can be recognized from each other. So when you say, for example, Fulan al-Hashimi, then it is known that that person is from Banu Hashim, and therefore his tribe is recognized. And today, for example, where countries are important, and it matters which country you're from. So, for example, if someone were to add after his name the country that he is from or the land that he is from, then that would be of importance, so that the one he's addressing knows where he is or where this individual is situated and where he is from. So these nisab, because the purpose of this nisbah is actually ta'rif, to gain recognition, these nisab can be done to different things. For example, the nisbah can be to the place where a person is from. Like we have Ash-Shurumbulali. Okay. You have Al-Makki, Al-Madani, for example. These are nisab towards where that individual is from. Yahya An-Naysaburi, for example. Al-Kufi, for example. So the nisbah can be to the balad, the city or the place where this individual is from. And that's why sometimes you have an individual that was born in a certain land and he grew up there, but then he traveled and he moved, for example. So, for example, for them, they'll say he was, let's say, for example, someone was born in Mecca and then he traveled later on and he moved to Medina. So they say Al-Makki thumma al-Madani. So the purpose over here is ta'rif, to grant that individual recognition. Where is he from? So sometimes the nisbah is towards the place where this individual is from. And sometimes the nisbah is towards his blood, his tribe. So Fulan al-Hashimi, for example. They'll say, for example, regarding some scholars, al-Hasani or al-Husayni, yani he's from the progeny of Hassan radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, or Hussein radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Like Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. Okay. And regarding Bukhari, we say Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, because he's from Bukhara. So that nisbah is towards the place where Imam Bukhari is from. And like I said, sometimes the nisbah is towards the blood, the tribe that the individual is from. So al-Shaybani, for example. And sometimes the nisbah is the nisbah of wala'ul Islam. So in the name of Bukhari, for example, you have al-Ju'fi mawlahum. So this nisbah, al-Ju'fi, is towards the nisbah towards the tribe, not because Imam Bukhari himself is from the tribe, but rather because his great-grandfather Mughira accepted Islam at the hands of an individual from that tribe. And again, to grant recognition. And sometimes a nisbah can actually be towards the profession of the individual, what he used to do. Sometimes a nisbah can be towards the profession of that individual and what that individual used to do. Like al-Iskafi, for example. So these nisab, the purpose of these nisab is, once again, ta'rif, to grant that individual recognition so that the one he is addressing and speaking to, he knows who he is addressing. Okay. And this ya is ya'un nisbah. This ya is ya'un nisbah. And because the purpose of these nisab is ta'rif, therefore sometimes one individual can have multiple nisab. Like you have the author over here, he says al-Wafa'i nisbatan ila طريقته في التصوف, and he has الشرنبلالي نسبة إلى بلده أو قريته, and he has الحنفي نسبة إلى مذهبه. So Imam Nawawi, for example, Abu Zakaria Yahnu Sharaf An-Nawawi is nisbah ila Nawa, which is where he's from, the name of the town where he is from. You have Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, al-Imam al-Shafi'i. Shafi'i is one of the great grandfathers of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, and he's also known as al-Muttalibi because he's from Banu al-Muttalib. Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man ibn Thabit al-Kufi, because he's from Kufa. So the purpose of these ta'rif, or the ta'rif which is done in these nisab, the purpose of these nisab is ta'rif, to grant recognition for that individual. طيب, he says, عفى الله عنه, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pardon him. What does he say? قال العبد الفقير إلى مولاه الغني أبو الإخلاص حسن الوفائي الشرنبلالي الحنفي. He says, إنه قد التمس مني بعض الأخلاء. إنه قد التمس مني بعض الأخلاء عاملنا الله وإياهم بلطفه الخفي أن أعمل مقدمة في العبادات تقرب على المبتدئ ما تشتت من المسائل في المطولات، فاستعنت بالله تعالى وأجبته طالبا للثواب، ولا أذكر إلا ما جزم بصحته أهل الترجيح من غير إطناب، وسميته نور الإيضاح ونجاة الأرواح. He says, قد التمس مني بعض الأخلاء. Some friends, they requested from me. Iltamasa means to request. They requested from me. And then this is a jumla mu'tarida. He makes a dua for these friends, these students that requested him this request. He says, عَامَلَنَا اللَّهُ وَإِيَّاهُمْ بِلُطْفِهِ الْخَفِي. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala treat us and them with his بِلُطْفِهِ الْخَفِي, with his lutf, with his kindness, his generosity, which is precise. Al-Khafi literally means hidden. And Latafa as well, lutf is referring to kindness and care. But Latafa as well refers to things which are very precise and hidden. So by saying بِلُطْفِهِ الْخَفِي, is a special consideration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's making dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants us, himself, and as well as the students that requested him, a special consideration. And he grants them from his blessings. He says, they requested me an a'mala muqaddimatan fil ibadat, that I compile a muqaddima with regards to ibadat. A muqaddima with regards to ibadat. Now, when they say muqaddima can either refer to that that passage which the author will present in the beginning of his book as an introduction, like a preface, like this entire passage over here is called muqaddimatul muallif. So this is a preface, this is an introduction that he gives before he actually starts in the what we call sulbul mawdu', the actual topic or the actual compilation. So the author will present an introduction that everyone will read to understand why he maybe compiled the work, what his purpose is in compiling the work. And then he'll start with the actual work and compilation. That we could use muqaddimah to refer to that. But muqaddimah can also refer to a book which would be studied at the beginner level. Because these smaller works that are studied at a beginner level, they are meant to introduce the student who wishes to study that science into that science. It's like entering the gate, the door of that science. So fiqh, jurisprudence, is mashallah tabarakallah a massive ilm. And there are so many compilations that have been compiled regarding this ilm, which is ilm al-fiqh. And when a student first enters this world, the world of fiqh, he has to be introduced and brought in into this amazing world, step by step. When you climb a ladder, you climb from the bottom. You don't just jump to the top. So as he enters in step by step, the first thing he's introduced to is a basic matan, a basic text, which will allow him to gain a little bit of recognition with how the science works, so that he starts getting accustomed and creating a liking for that science. And then later on, he is granted more detailed compilations in that same ilm, in that science, and then he continues on and he studies. So why is the beginner level text known as a muqaddimah? Because that compilation, that text will serve as an introduction for the student who wishes to study that science, and it will pave the path for him and make it easy for him to access the later books that are in more detail. So that's why they would call these beginner level texts, they would call them as well as a muqaddimah, as an introductory text. Now, muqaddimah can be read muqaddimah, and it can also be read as muqaddamah. If you read it from muqaddimah, then this would actually be in the meaning of al-mutaqaddimah, meaning the one that comes first. Al-muqaddimah would be in the meaning of al-mutaqaddimah, meaning the one that comes first. As for al-muqaddamah would be in the meaning of the one that was brought first, the one that was made to be presented first. Meaning itself didn't necessarily need to be in the beginning. However, it was made to be brought first. So you can say both al-muqaddimah and you can say al-muqaddimah. Some ulama, they say that you shouldn't say muqaddimah, you should say muqaddimah, because the asl is that it's from al-mutaqaddimah, the one that is first. يعني حقه أن يكون أولا. It's deserving, it's right is that it be the first. And there's some ulama that say no, you can say both. And some ulama say that the asl, the default is actually bil kasr, muqaddimah. However, in language, they also used bil fath in certain scenarios. In certain scenarios. So in reality, like you can say both. You can say al-muqaddimah and you can also say al-muqaddamah. However, it's better to say al-muqaddimah It's better to say al-Muqaddimah because at that point it will be in the meaning of al-Mutaqaddimah. And that is more appropriate because what is mentioned in the Muqaddimah is meant to be the first thing which is addressed. طيب, he says, أن أعمل مقدمة في العبادات, regarding al-ibadat. Now, what does he mean when he says al-ibadat? For this, we will mention a little bit regarding fiqh in the beginning. What is fiqh? What is the science of fiqh? And what are the different topics that are discussed in the science of fiqh? And then why ibadat is usually in the books of fiqh chosen as the first discussion which is presented. So number one, when it comes to fiqh, we have a linguistic definition of al-fiqh, and we have an istilahi definition of al-fiqh. And in the science of jurisprudence and the science of fiqh, what the term fiqh refers to what exactly? So linguistically, al-fiqh, if it comes from the bab of faqiha bil-kasri, yani faqiha yafqahu. Faqiha yafqahu is in the meaning of fahm, understanding. مطلق الفهم. Okay. مطلق العلم, general knowledge, anything you understand. That would be from the bab of faqiha yafqahu. And if it was from the bab of faquha, from bab of karuma, faquha yafquhu, with the masdar of faqaha, this would be in the meaning of صار فقيها. صار فقيها. Why? Because this bab, the bab of karuma, is usually brought to indicate upon a sajiyah, to indicate upon a characteristic in an individual, a trait within an individual, which is not a trait or not something he acted upon once in his lifetime, but rather it's a trait, it is a characteristic of that individual. So usually what is upon this bab of faqha, from the khawas, from the meanings of the bab of karuma, is that it indicates upon sajaya, something which becomes a trait within an individual. So if faqha was to be brought upon this bab, faqha yafquhu faqahatan, it would be in the meaning of sara faqihan, meaning that individual had attained a malaka fiqhiyya, not simply that he understood something, rather he attained a malaka fiqhiyya. Whereas faqiha is just in the meaning of understanding. And the first meaning, which is mutlaqul ilm or mutlaqul fahm, just simply understanding, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran in many places, He uses this word in this meaning. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, فَمَا لِهَؤُلَاءِ الْقَوْمِ لَا يَكَادُونَ يَفْقَهُونَ حَدِيثًا. فَمَا لِهَؤُلَاءِ الْقَوْمِ لَا يَكَادُونَ يَفْقَهُونَ حَدِيثًا. This is from Bab Sami'a. يَفْقَهُونَ. What is wrong with this group of individuals, with these people? لَا يَكَادُونَ يَفْقَهُونَ حَدِيثًا. It's as if they don't understand anything. Over here, faqiha is simply in the meaning of fahima, as if they don't understand anything. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also said in the Quran, وَجَعَلْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً أَن يَفْقَهُوهُ وَفِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرًا. That upon their hearts, may Allah protect us, we placed a barrier that they be able to understand. Meaning they can't understand because we placed a barrier over their hearts. And Allah says, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. That there is nothing except that it praises Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, glorifies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. However, you don't understand their glorification. You don't understand their praise. So, لَا تَفْقَهُونَ over here is not in the meaning of you're not faqih. It's in the meaning of you don't understand. مُطْلَقُ الْفَهْم. So this has been used in the Quran. In fact, fiqh, normally when it's used in the Quran, these three letters, faqaf, ha, they're referring to general understanding. They're not referring to fiqh as a science. Because again, these sciences came into existence later on. So these terms, they were not solidified in the beginning. They were solidified later on. That's why whenever we define words like this, we normally define them linguistically, and we also define them with the term definition. With the termed definition. Some scholars have added that regarding the first definition which we mentioned, which is faqiha, is in the meaning of understanding. Some scholars added the clause that it's not simply understanding anything. Rather, it's understanding more detailed matters. يعني فهم ما دق وغمض. Something which is a bit more precise and requires a bit more attention to understand it. Why? Because they say, nobody says فقهت أن السماء فوقي. You will say that I know that the sky is above my head. But you don't say فقهت أن السماء فوقي in Arabic. Why? Because it's so obvious. It doesn't require thought at all. It is obvious. But you will say, for example, فقهت معنى كلامك. Like, I got what you're trying to say. I understood what you are trying to say in Arabic. This word is used in this context. So Ash-Shirazi rahimahullah ta'ala, the great Shafi'i jurist, he mentioned that fiqh is not simply understanding anything. Rather, it's understanding matters which are a bit more precise and require a bit more detail. Understanding those matters. And some scholars have mentioned, Al-Razi rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions that fiqh actually refers to understanding the exact point that the speaker is trying to make. غرض المتكلم من كلامه. The one who speaks, understanding the exact point that he is trying to make and what he is actually trying to suggest through his speech. So now you had these three definitions that are mentioned, or four definitions. One is general understanding, one is understanding matters that are a bit more precise, and one is understanding, it will be specifically used when you are trying to understand the point that you are being addressed with by an individual in his speech. So this is the linguistic definition of fiqh. As for the istilahi definition of fiqh, meaning as a term, what does fiqh refer to? When we say fiqh, what is that referring to? So this also evolved throughout the centuries. In the beginning, the term fiqh was not referring to one aspect or one specific science, one very, very specific realm within the sciences of Sharia. Rather, the term fiqh would be used to refer to a general understanding of religion. A general understanding of religion, whether it be matters of aqaid, and what do you believe in as a Muslim, or whether it be matters of, how you attain a stronger connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whether it be pertaining to commandments and rulings. What do you have to do? What can you not do? What is better for you to do? What is demanded and requested from you? Commandments and rulings. So in the beginning, the term fiqh was not specific to only commandments or rulings. What is haram, what is halal, what is wajib, what is mustahab, what is makruh. Rather, general understanding and knowledge pertaining to the deen, the term fiqh would be used in that understanding. And that's why Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, who's one of the first who defined al-fiqh, he defined fiqh by saying al-fiqhu ma'rifatu nafsi ma laha wa ma alayha. Fiqh is for an individual to know what is for it and what is against it. And that's very general. Meaning, what does he believe in? What should he believe in? And what can he not believe in? What should he not believe in? What is permissible for him in wealth, in actions, and what is impermissible. نعم. So it's a very general definition. الفقه معرفة النفس ما لها وما عليها. And this was in the beginning. But later on, as the sciences became more codified, the term fiqh started being used for a very specific science from the sciences, or around a very specific realm from the different discussions that occur within the Islamic sciences, within that which is pertaining to the Islamic sciences. So they would specifically use the term fiqh to refer to commandments and rulings that had to do with the actions of the mukallafin, of those that are held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So is this action permissible? Is it not permissible? Is it preferable? Is it disliked? Or is it in the middle? All of the actions that are done by humans that are held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a child, for example, is not mukallaf. A child, if he doesn't pray salah, that's fine. Because he is not, it's not, there's not, we don't have a mandation upon the child that a child must perform salah. He's not mukallaf. But when that child reaches the age of puberty and he's considered an adult Islamically, at that point, salah becomes compulsory upon him, the 5 daily salawat. So, for example, salah is now an action which is compulsory upon the baligh individual. Likewise, we have zakah with certain conditions, and we have hajj with conditions, and we have fasting in the month of Ramadan, and we have other commandments. So the discussions that would pertain to the commandments of the actions of those that are mukallaf by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that science that discusses these commandments, whether it's wajib, whether it's mandub, mustahab, whether it's mubah, yani for example, it's fine, yani both ways are equal, whether you do it or you don't do it, or whether it's disliked or whether it's haram. These commandments and the rulings of the actions, the science that will discuss that science specifically will be called fiqh. And so the ta'rif which is mainly adopted in fiqh is al-ilmu bil-ahkam al-shar'iyyah al-amaliyah al-muktasaba min adillatiha at-tafsiliyah. Al-ilmu bil-ahkam al-shar'iyyah al-amaliyah al-muktasaba min adillatiha at-tafsiliyah. Now, inshallah, in the later books, we'll go into more detail regarding exactly what this definition entails within it. For now, what we need to keep in our mind is the science which is pertaining to the rulings and commandments of the actions that are done by the mukallaf, the one who is made responsible by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those actions, their commandments, and those commandments that are derived from the textual evidences, or from the evidences from the Quran and Sunnah. This science is called fiqh, the science that deals with these discussions. What is the command, for example, if someone wants to stand up and drink water? Is that permissible? Is that impermissible? If someone wants to not fast in the month of Ramadan because he's traveling, is that permissible? Is that is that impermissible? Must he fast? So these questions are answered in the science of fiqh. The science of fiqh has to do with permissibility versus impermissibility, and all of that which is in between the two, and has to do with the actions of the mukallafeen. طيب, so this is the definition of fiqh linguistically. We mentioned the definition of fiqh istilahan. There are different realms that these actions can divide into. So we can call them the majalat, the different majalat that are discussed in the books of fiqh. Because action is a very general term. So from the majalat of fiqh, we have ibadat, worship, the actions that are used to worship. So this majal of fiqh, yani which is ibadat, that will pertain to salah, praying salah, and the conditions that are needed in order for someone to pray salah. Like, for example, purification. A person must be in the state of tahara. He must be in the state of purity in order for his salah to count. The timings of salah. Okay. So, one of the majalat of fiqh is ibadat. Pertains to salah, the commandments regarding salah. How do you perform salah? Okay. What is necessary in salah? What are the conditions of salah? Then, for example, we have zakat as well. What are the conditions by which zakat will become a mandation upon an individual? Okay, if someone wanted to give zakat, for example, earlier, before it even became compulsory upon him, is that possible? If someone doesn't give zakat and he delays it, okay, is he sinful? If he initially in the beginning of the year has a certain amount of wealth, but then that wealth decreases throughout the year, and then he, at the end of the year, he ends up having more wealth again, okay, will zakat be applicable upon those amounts? Likewise, Psalm, fasting. When do you fast? When is it necessary to fast? When is it liked to fast? When is it disliked to fast? Is it possible that there are certain days in the year where it's impermissible to fast? And Hajj. All of this is regarding worship, acts of worship, actions that are worship. So this is one majal of fiqh, which is ibadat. Then you have al-ahwal al-shakhsiyah, which has to do with individual things that a person will experience on his daily life between people, his relationship with other individuals. So in this, we have discussions regarding nikah and talaq. Okay, nikah, which is a beautiful bond that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presented between two individuals, and He sanctioned. And there are rules associated with nikah. How is nikah performed? When nikah is performed? What are the rights of the husband? What are the rights of the wife? What is expected from both? What is permissible from both for both? What is impermissible for both? So ahkam pertaining to commandments, pertaining to rulings, pertaining to nikah. And likewise, you have talaq, which is the divorce, which is breaking that bond. And so in matters of divorce, okay, how, if someone must give divorce, how is he expected to be giving divorce and whatnot? And likewise, you have matters of rada'a and nasab and nafaqat and mawarith, inheritance. When a person passes away, how is the wealth of that individual distributed? Who is considered to be from the inheritors versus the ones that won't be considered to receive any wealth? And likewise, nafaqat, on a person who lives, are there individuals around him upon whom it's necessary for him to spend and assist, that are under his responsibility? So this majal, this realm, this aspect of fiqh has to do with ahwal shakhsiyah, which is huquq Allah has created, rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created between individuals because of a certain bond that they have or relationships that they have. This is another majal of fiqh. Then we have mu'amalat, transactions. Mu'amalat, transactions. So buyu', buying and selling. Al-mu'awadat al-maliyah, exchanging products for money, buying and selling. And likewise, you have in mu'amalat, you also have al-mukhasamat. And if, for example, if there's an argument between two individuals, okay, one claims that the seller did not actually sell me the product that I was entitled to, or the way he informed me that I would receive the product, or the product, for example, has a defect in it and I want to return it. So who is deserving of rights in that regard? And what are those rights? What are the rights that are for the seller? What are the rights that are for the buyer? And whatnot. And what would nullify a transaction from an Islamic perspective? All of the commandments regarding transactions. And for example, you also have al-amanat, all of the commandments regarding amana. If someone were to place an item and give it to someone else for that individual to hold as a trust to keep safe, and he lost the item, for example. Or let's say, for example, someone travels and he leaves his car with one of his friends, okay, as an amana. So what are the commandments pertaining? Like, for example, let's say someone he traveled and he left a sum of money with one of his relatives or one of his friends, and it so happened that that individual, like his house burnt down. So is he responsible to return that sum of money or not? So this all has to do with mu'amalat, transactions that are between two individuals. Some have even added in mu'amalat munakahat, any matters of nikah and divorce, they've added it in mu'amalat, as well as matters of inheritance, they added it to be part of mu'amalat. طيب. You also have then السياسة الشرعية, the majal of السياسة الشرعية, which is politics. So Islam obviously didn't only come with commandments that pertain to worship and that pertain to simply transactions between individuals, or that pertain to the livelihood of people in terms of marriage and divorce and the relationships and the bonds that are between individuals. Rather, it also came with commandments pertaining to how a state is run, and commandments pertaining to establishing a state and running a state, legislation of qawanin, of laws, so that order is established. This has to do with as-siyasa ash-shar'iyya. Okay, so what are the rights of the public upon the leader, and what are the rights that the leader deserves upon the public, upon his ra'iyya? طيب. We then have the majal of al-uqubat, the majal of al-uqubat, which is punishments. So for example, there are criminals and there are individuals that will take the rights of others. So what are the punishments that will be established at a state level for those individuals that take the rights of other individuals? If someone, for example, went and killed someone, okay, how will he be punished? If someone went and robbed another individual, how will he be, or what is considered sariqa to begin with? And how will he be considered, or how will he be punished? So all of the commands pertaining to establishing the punishments for or upon criminals. So this is another majal of fiqh. And then we have as-siyar. As-siyar is like foreign policy in today's language. So for example, the connection or the relationship between countries. So if there's a Muslim country, okay, a Muslim state, how are the relationships that that Muslim state will have with other states, other countries? Okay, and if there was to be, for example, war, what are the rules and guidelines that war that will be adopted in warfare? Likewise, for example, if there was to be a peace treaty, then what are the rules and guidelines that are adopted? And can you make treaties? How long can those treaties be? What kind of treaties that can be made? So all of the commandments pertaining to the relationship of a Muslim country with another or with non-Muslim countries, this would be called as-siyar. And this is an entire section in chapters of fiqh. And then we have adab. Another majal from the majalat of fiqh is adab, the ahkam that pertain to akhlaq and mahasin. Okay, how should a person act? What are good traits that should be adopted, like sympathy, being kind, being generous, being accepting of others, removing racism, and all of what pertains to this. So this has to do with adab. So the majalat of fiqh are many. In fiqh, we have discussions regarding the commandments pertaining to ibadat. We have discussions regarding the commandments pertaining to ahwal shakhsiyya. We have discussions regarding the commandments pertaining to mu'amalat. Likewise, as-siyasa ash-shar'iyya. Likewise, uqubat. Likewise, siyar. Likewise, adab. So you have many different chapters within fiqh. Usually the books will start off with ibadat. Why is that the case that they start off with ibadat? Because from all of these different majalat that we mentioned, the most important is ibadat, because ibadat, the acts of worship, they pertain to the rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has upon his slaves. Whereas the rest of the majalat, the rest of the realms that we mentioned, they pertain to rights between the slaves, amongst each other. The right of a human upon another human. But ibadat, they pertain to the rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserves upon the creation. And Allah's right is muqaddam upon all other rights. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as he says in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. The reason I created the jinn kind and mankind is so that they worship me. They believe in me and they worship me. So one of the wisdoms behind the creation of people was that behind the creation of humans was that so we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is discussed first. The right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the first thing which we mention. And the most important form of ibadah, is, or the most important act of ibadah is salah. And that's why the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the difference between the Muslim and the disbeliever, or the believer and the disbeliever, is salah. So salah is an extremely important act of worship. The most important from all of the acts of worship. And that's why Muslims, we perform salah 5 times a day. So therefore, from the ibadat, the first act of worship which they will discuss is salah. And salah has conditions. A person can't just perform salah. There are conditions that are necessary before a person performs salah. And one of the most important conditions is purity. Why? Because purity is a condition that applies to multiple things. Not just the body, not just the clothing that the person is wearing, but also the place where he's performing salah. So the purification, the purity of the clothing that a person is wearing while he performs salah. The purity of his body. He has to be in the state of wudu. The purity of the place where he performs salah. So tahara is broad. And it's an important condition. So that's why from the ibadat, from salah, they will usually mention tahara first. So what does he say over here? He says, إِنَّهُ قَدْ الْتَمَسَ مِنِّي بَعْضُ الْأَخِلَّاءِ أَنْ أَعْمَلَ مُقَدِّمَةً فِي الْعِبَادَةِ. That I present for them a beginner level text when it comes to ibadat only. And so in this work, in Nur al-Īdāh, the author will only speak regarding ibadat, not the rest of the majala fiqh. This work is only for ibadat. Salah, Sawm, or Zakat, Sawm, Hajj. And in the beginning, the author had not completed all of the entire book. He had mentioned some aspects or some ibadat and he left some. And later on, he ended up completing the rest of the book, as mentioned in the Hashiyah. First, he simply mentioned the ahkam of tahara, salah, and siyam. That's what he first initially compiled. And then later on, he added the commandments pertaining to zakat and hajj. طيب, he says, تقرب على المبتدئ ما تشتت من المسائل في المطولات. They requested me that I prepare for them a beginner level text. تقرب, that will bring closer على المبتدئ, upon the beginner level student, ما تشتت من المسائل في المطولات. Min over here is bayan. يعني ما من المسائل, تشتت means to be spread out. So the commandments, the masail, the more detailed masail that were all over the place, that are spread out in the mutawwalat, in the more lengthy compilations, okay, they requested me to compile a beginner level text with regards to ibadat that will make it easy to study these masail without all of the extra detail that's not necessarily needed in the beginning. So he says, فَاسْتَعَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ تَعَالَى, I sought the assistance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَجَبْتُهُ طَالِبًا لِلثَّوَابِ, and I answered the request of this individual, طَالِبًا لِلثَّوَابِ, hoping of the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hopeful of the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, وَلَا أَذْكُرُ إِلَّا مَا جَزْمَ بِهِ بِصِحَّتِهِ أَهْلُ التَّرْجِيحِ. I don't mention except that upon its validity the scholars of tarjih have agreed upon. And we mentioned that for the majority, the author, yes, Ash-Shurumbulari rahimahullah ta'ala, will suffice with what the scholars of tarjih had considered to be valid. But in certain masail, he gives tarjih to actually the opinion which is not considered the more accepted opinion amongst the Hanafi jurists, amongst the scholars of Tarjih. And when that comes, inshallah, we'll mention that. He says, min ghayri itnab. Yani the whole purpose is min ghayri itnab. Itnab is excessive elongation, like simply prolonging for the sake of, just prolonging the book. So min ghayri itnab. وسميته, he says, I call the book نور الإيضاح ونجاة الأرواح. نور الإيضاح ونجاة الأرواح. He says, والله أسأل أن ينفع به عباده ويديم به الإفادة. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, I ask of that He grants benefit through it, through the book, His slaves. Meaning I ask Allah that He grants benefit through this work, His slaves. ويديم به الإفادة. And He, adama yudimu is to grant dawam, continuity. Meaning He continuously grants benefit. Ifada is to grant benefit. He continuously is granting benefit through this. Meaning not just, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted this dua of His. Until today, we are studying, and all over the world, the Hanafi students, they study this work of His. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from him and grant him the greatest reward for this beautiful book that he has compiled. And bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, in the next lesson, we will start with Kitab al-Tahara.